मध्ये महाभारतम् अद्वैतामृतवर्षिणीं भगवतीम् अष्टादशाध्यायिनीम् अम्ब त्वामनुसन्दधामि भगवद्गीते भवद्वेषिणीम् नमोऽस्तु ते व्यासविशालबुद्धे पुल्लारविन्दाय तपत्रनेत्र येन त्वया भारततैलपूर्णः प्रज्वालितो ज्ञानमयप्रदीपः प्रपन्नपारिजाताय स्तोत्रवेत्रैकपाणये ज्ञानमुद्राय कृष्णाय गीतामृतदुहे नमः। सर्वोपनिषदो गावो दोग्धा गोपालनन्दनः पार्थो वत्सः सुधीर्भोक्ता दुग्धं गीतामृतं महत् वसुदेवसुतं देवं कंसचाणूरमर्दनं देवकी परमानन्दं कृष्णं वन्दे जगद्गुरुं तं ब्रह्मा वरुणेन्द्ररुद्रमरुतः स्तुन्वन्ति दिव्यैस्तवैः वेदैः साङ्गपदक्रमोपनिषदैः गायन्ति यं सामगाः ध्यानावस्थिततद्गतेन मनसा पश्यन्ति यं योगिनो यस्यान्तन्न विदुःसुरासुरगणाः देवाय तस्मै नमः।
Om Gurubhyo Namaha. We continue with Chapter 5, Karma Sannyasa Yoga, the Yoga of Action and Renunciation of Action. Here is the essence of verses 21 and 22, translation and commentary by Maharishi. Let us begin. Bahyasparsheshva saktatma vindyatyatmani yat sukham sabrahma yoga yuktatma sukhamakshaya masnute. Next. Yehi sansparsaja bhoga dukkayonaya evate adyantavantah kaunteya na teshu ramate buddha. Here is the English translation. He whose self is untouched by external contacts knows that happiness which is in the self. His self, joined in union with Brahman, he enjoys eternal happiness. I'll repeat this when we come back to the verse. Now this is verse number 22. All pleasures born of contact are only sources of sorrow. They have a beginning and an end, O son of Kunti. The enlightened man does not rejoice in them. Now let's go back and briefly review verse number 20. Here we understood that the knower of Brahman neither greatly rejoices on obtaining what is dear to him, nor he grieves much on obtaining what is unpleasant. So this knower of Brahman has steady intellect and is free from delusion. And this knower of Brahman is established in Brahman. Here we also understood that this one established in Brahman, his mind is deeply rooted in the bliss consciousness of the self, and so naturally remains unaffected by the attachment or aversion in the objects of the senses. Here, this knower of Brahman is in the natural state of renunciation, which has been realized through yoga or through Sankhya. Here, he has realized the independent nature of the self, and although established in divine consciousness, he keeps his feet on the ground, and remaining on the human level, he is divine. Now let's come back to verse number 21. I will read again. He whose self is untouched by external contacts knows that happiness which is in the self. His self joined in union with Brahman, he enjoys eternal happiness. Let us look at the important phrases here. He whose self is untouched by external contacts knows that happiness which is in the self. Next, his self joined in union with Brahman. And finally, he enjoys eternal happiness. So here when Bhagavan says, he whose self is untouched by external contacts, he means that the self is forever established in its own essential nature, which is the bliss consciousness. And moreover, this bliss consciousness has become permanent. Here, Brahman is a state which embraces both activity and bliss consciousness. And when this bliss consciousness comes in contact with objects, it produces a state described by the expression, his self joined in union with Brahman. Let us try to understand this further. Listen carefully. We have already understood that self is untouched by external contacts. Here Bhagavan is saying, he whose self is untouched by external contacts knows that happiness which is in the self. We have already seen that in order to gain the experience of the inner self in the transcendental state of consciousness, the experiencer has to go beyond the experience of outside objects, which means the experience of outside objects has to be eliminated. Through constant experience, the self becomes so familiar to the mind that the very nature of the mind is transformed. And so here the mind is transformed into the nature of the self. And when this happens, then the transcendental consciousness is maintained together with the waking state of consciousness and continues to support all activity as it did before. So when this transcendental consciousness is maintained permanently, then the self is always experienced as self. So again here, the self is always experienced as self, and simultaneously the activity continues to be experienced in the waking state. And this is how the self is experienced as separate from activity. So here in this state, the self, which is of the small s, the individual self, is lost forever, and it has become the higher self. So again here, with the loss of the self, that is the individual self, the contact of the self with objects through the agency of the mind and senses, which was responsible for giving rise to experience, becomes non-existent. And now what remains is the self alone, in its pure nature of bliss consciousness, and it is devoid of any contact with the objects that were held by the individual self. Let me read this verse again so that you understand. He whose self is untouched by external contacts knows that happiness which is in the self. Now let us look further with the next phrase. His self joined in union with Brahman, he enjoys eternal happiness. A seeker knows when he has gained Brahmistiti or the state of Brahman, when he experiences this state, the self joined in union with Brahman, and along with it, the self is untouched by external contacts. So here, the mind is experiencing objects through the senses, but he is awake in the awareness of his self as separate from the field of experience and action. And we have seen that this is the state of cosmic consciousness in which one is awake in the world and also awake in himself. So again, his self joined in union with Brahman, he enjoys eternal happiness. Here, many commentators have done great injustice to the teaching of this verse by suggesting that it describes a technique of enjoying the bliss of the self by means of constructing a mood of remaining unaffected while experiencing joy through the objects of the senses. Further, many translations have treated the original text in a way which, while consistent with the grammar of the verse, presents a false picture of its teaching and is contrary to the essential principle of action and of renunciation. So here there is no constructing a mood or mood making that while remaining unaffected, even though he is experiencing joy through the objects of the senses. So again here, enjoying the bliss of the self by constructing a mood gives a false picture and is contrary to the essential principle of action and of renunciation. So here it is important for a seeker to understand that one has to gain this Brahmistiti or the state of Brahman, which is also referred to here as cosmic consciousness. It is only then one experiences the permanency of bliss consciousness, and this can be gained through the yoga of action, and also it can be gained through the yoga of renunciation based on Sankhya. So here, when the permanency of this bliss consciousness is gained, the self is unaffected during the experience of joy. So again, it is not the intellectual practice of trying to hold the mind back and keep it unaffected during the process of experience that brings one to bliss consciousness and to the state of renunciation. It is simply because the self is joined in union with Brahman that a man enjoys eternal happiness. And further, in this state, the self is experienced as separate from activity. Now let us try to understand why the joys of the senses do not make a deep impression in the enlightened man. The reason here is that in the enlightened man, his self has become the self, which means the individual self has become the self of all. And the nature of this self is bliss consciousness. So it is wholly blissful in nature. So this awakened being remains wide awake in cosmic intelligence, and his natural stand is at the fountainhead of all the joys of all the senses. So here, when one is naturally and permanently established in absolute bliss, then the temporary joys of relative existence fail to fascinate his self. So here, even when the sensory objects come into contact with his senses, the joys of these contacts are not so powerful, and they do not cause the distraction of the self from its natural state of bliss consciousness. And this is why his self remains unaffected while his senses are fully in contact with their objects. This verse places Samkhya and Yoga on a common basis. With these expressions, self is untouched by external contacts, knows that happiness which is in the self, and his self joined in union with Brahman. Let me read the verse finally so that it makes all sense. He whose self is untouched by external contacts knows that happiness which is in the self. His self, joined in union with Brahman, he enjoys eternal happiness. And here is the next verse, verse number 22. All pleasures born of contact are only sources of sorrow. They have a beginning and an end, O son of Kunti. The enlightened man does not rejoice in them. So here there are three important phrases. All pleasures born of contact are only sources of sorrow. Next, they have a beginning and an end, O son of Kunti. Finally, the enlightened man does not rejoice in them. Now let us look at them one by one. Here, Bhagavan is trying to clarify the principle of happiness and suffering. Here, when Bhagavan is saying all pleasures born of contact are only sources of sorrow, so here it clearly means the contact of the self who is not established in eternal bliss consciousness. So here one has not attained this cosmic consciousness, and this individual self, when in the field of activity or experience, remains in a state in which the self remains involved with the field of experience and joys of the senses. So here the individual self does not remain untouched and so gets involved with the field of experience. And because of its involvement, such joys are sources of sorrow for one who has not realized his self. So again, if the self remains untouched, as in self-realization, then the joys of the senses are not sources of sorrow. For in that state, the self is established in eternal happiness. So here again, when Bhagavan is saying all pleasures born of contact are only sources of sorrow, he is clearly referring to one who does not have the realization of the self, of his true nature. In general, the intensity of happiness that one can enjoy depends on the level of one's consciousness. We understand that every level of consciousness there is a corresponding intensity of happiness. And in addition to happiness, this principle applies also to intelligence and power. So again, at every level of consciousness, there is a corresponding intensity of happiness and also a corresponding intelligence and power. Here we are further understanding that there is a big difference between the consciousness of the enlightened man and that of the unenlightened. So this difference between the enlightened and the unenlightened is as great as that between the absolute and the relative, and also as great between light and darkness. So for this reason, the joys of the senses which delight the ignorant are looked upon as sources of sorrow by the wise. Further, in comparison with the eternal bliss of the Absolute, in which the enlightened are naturally established, these fleeting joys of the world are only sources of sorrow. So when Bhagavan says, all pleasures born of contact are only sources of sorrow, and all have a beginning and an end, O son of Kunti, he is trying to express the truth and at the same time strike hard at the minds of those who are engrossed in such joys and whose vision is thus blinded. Now let us understand this further. The experience of the objects of the senses in the waking state differs from that in the state of cosmic consciousness. So this experience may be likened to the experience of objects through glasses of different colors. So when one is looking at the same object through different glasses of different colors, then it is experienced differently. Before enlightenment, one is able to rejoice in them, but the enlightened man now is not in a position to rejoice in them as he did before realization because of the difference in his state of consciousness. Now let us look at further about the truth of these enjoyments of the world. When we look at this statement given by Bhagavan, pleasures born of contact are only sources of sorrow, it seems absurd looking at it from the ordinary level of consciousness. Because from this level of consciousness, these pleasures, though momentary, seem very real. But even at this level of consciousness, this principle that they are only sources of sorrow applies because all of these pleasures and joys have a beginning and an end. So when they are not permanent and they have a beginning and an end, then they can only be sources of sorrow. So now we understand that the truth about the enjoyments of the world is valid when considered from the level of cosmic consciousness and from that of God consciousness. Here one sees the ultimate reality of life and the ultimate truth about these pleasures, and also that they do not last forever. So again, when we understand that these pleasures have a beginning and an end, and they are different from the eternal happiness, then the seeker will strive to gain the higher states of consciousness. Here again, when one joy comes to an end, the self is subjected to a state without joy. And this lack of joy, in contrast, is referred to as suffering. Again, if the self, the individual self, delights in the experience of objects, since these objects are changing, this delight will soon be lost. So this loss of pleasure will give rise to suffering. And so here when Bhagavan says they have a beginning and an end, he is reminding us that one who lacks contact with inner being becomes engrossed in external pleasures. The enlightened man does not rejoice in them. So here again, the absence of bliss consciousness is the source of sorrow. So here, if the self has gained a state of perpetual happiness, then it is left with no possibility of suffering. Now let us look further at this phrase, the enlightened man does not rejoice in them. And why is it so? Because he is established in the state of eternal happiness, he is in Brahmi Sthiti, and he is experiencing the self as separate from activity. Further, he has by nature risen above the phenomenal phases of life. He has risen above the fleeting joys of the relative field, and so he is not in a state where he can rejoice in temporary joys. For example, if a retailer becomes a wholesale merchant, he no longer deals in the retail field, which requires more effort and produces less profit. So here finally, if the self has gained the state of perpetual happiness, then it is left with no possibility of suffering. Let me read the verse again finally to understand. All pleasures born of contact are only sources of sorrow. They have a beginning and an end, O son of Kunti. The enlightened man does not rejoice in them. So here Bhagavan is telling all the seekers through Arjuna to be enlightened and not to be lost in these small pleasures which have a beginning and an end. Now we have covered two very important verses. We'll continue tomorrow. So I will end here. Jai Gurudev, Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu.
शास्त्र